Welcome. Hello. Welcome to the panel Social Media, Heaven or Hell. Before we plunge into discussion about the advantages and challenges that people face when using social media in crisis regions, I'd like to encourage you to make heavy use of the Twitter wall. You see it right here. Besides asking questions the old-fashioned way, you can also interact with the podium on this moderated Twitter wall. And we will discuss your questions after the introduction speech and the statements of each panelist. All you have to do is use the hashtag HuCo 2015 when sending a tweet. Let me briefly introduce the outstanding panelists of this session. Left to me, right from your side, Mahmoud Shabeeb is working as Regional Communications Officer for the Syria crisis for CARE International. He's a real social media enthusiast, which brought him to creating and managing several social media outlets through voluntary and professional work experiences. On Twitter, he describes himself as Muslim, Jordanian, Palestinian, Arab, educated young man and proud of each, die-hard worker and volunteer for a better world. He has a lot of experience in using social networks from the NGO point of view and will tell us about his experiences in his introduction speech, which will last about 15 minutes. His Twitter handle is itismoody. I think maybe after that you will see it on the Twitter wall. So go ahead and mention him if you want to ask questions. To the other side, Timo Lüge. He's a humanitarian communications professional. He has experience at both headquarters and field level. Timo has worked as journalist in Germany before, working for the Red Cross Red Crescent movement in Geneva, Haiti, and Liberia. Since starting his own consultancy, he has focused on advising humanitarian organizations in the field of digital communication. He also blogs, so go and read his blog, Social Media for Good, it is called. And his Twitter handle is Timo L-U-E, Timo Lü. To the left, Ingrid Brodnig, let me introduce to you. She formerly worked as head for the media department of Falter. Now she's writing for Profil about digital and political topics. She has also written a book, which I can highly recommend, on the dynamics and infrastructures of online communities, and she gives useful advice on how to deal with trolls. As an expert in online communication and politics, Ingrid knows how media organizations work and how they deal with humanitarian crises. Her username on Twitter is Brodnig. And last but not least, Thomas Seifert. He's working as a journalist for Wiener Zeitung. He covered the war in Kosovo, various crises in Africa, for example, Sierra Leone, Congo, and Burundi. Thomas covered the war in Chechnya and reported from the New York aftermath of 9/11. Just a couple of weeks later, he went to Afghanistan and also reported from Baghdad during the war in 2003. As an expert in war reporting and international relations, he can offer us very interesting insights on the topics. His Twitter handle is Thomas Seifert. So now I'd like you to start your introduction speech, Mahmoud. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone. It's a great honor and pleasure, both together, being here in this great platform for aid workers and activists, volunteers from all around the world who are trying their best for this world to become a little bit better, at least. Just waking up every day knowing that you're contributing a little bit to improve this world, I think is satisfying enough. As Lisa has mentioned, my name is Mahmoud Shabeeb, and I work as a Regional Communications Officer for the Syria crisis at CARE International, and I am based in my home country, Jordan. I would like to talk about do's and don'ts in social media in the beginning, which is probably a lot of us or most of us use social media, Facebook, Twitter, whatever your favorite platform is. But there are so many ways to improve the way you utilize social media and the way you can best serve your goals. And there are things that you can do that can damage that brand or damage your goals. So first of all, you have to keep your social media lively and active by interacting with people, by doing what you should do, but doing it in an authentic way and in a normal way, in a natural way. But do not try to damage that by just pushing it too far, misleading people, talking about things that are irrelevant to your brand, irrelevant to your goals. Another point is you should post one thing at a time, talk about one topic at a time in each tweet, post, whatever it is. But do not mention or talk about more than one thing in one post. Again, stay authentic, focus on quality rather than focusing on quantity. And one of the huge don'ts is that you should not get lost in the world of social media by just trying so hard to win likes, to win followers, to win traction by whatever means there are. And the last point that I would like to elaborate on a little bit is having perspective, having accountability, utilizing social media the way it should be utilized, which is a two-way flow of discussion, of feedback, of interaction. And this is why social media breaks the age of ivory tower. Before we all know that key people or stakeholders or even celebrities, whatever, you name it, were living in their ivory towers, only talking to people from just talking, not listening, not having feedback. Now, thanks to social media, this has ceased to exist. And if you're still holding on to your ivory tower, this will not do you any good. It will damage your image. It will ruin your credibility among your audiences. Social media that started in the mid of 2000s, I would say, because you know that Facebook started as a university project in Harvard University in 2004 and then became public for use in 2006. And so did Twitter. It also became public for use in 2006. However, social media in general has not become so public until, or at least in the world in general, but in my region, in the Middle East in particular, until the beginning of 2010s. And it is no coincidence that this has been in the same time of the emergence of what they call the Arab Spring, or the unrest in the different countries of the Middle East, starting from Tunisia in late 2010 via Facebook, YouTube, and blogs. And then following it shortly after, it was Egypt, which the unrest or the revolution there became very viral through also video blogging, Facebook, and Twitter, using hashtags that we have all seen, like Tahrir, etc. Social media also played a general big role in the rest of the unrests in the Arab world, following these countries in, of course, Syria, where my work focuses, Yemen, Libya, and the rest of the countries. I have to say that thanks to social media, even and we will talk about this in the panel furthermore, even in the unrests, because there are always two sides of the story, there are always two parties, or even more. But this way, thanks to social media, the smart person is the one who knows how to utilize this great means of communication and also double-edged sword to best serve their goals and to best serve their communities and audiences. What happens, excuse me, what happens is that social media became also a means for these public figures to interact with their communities, to deliver their messages and to convey whatever messages they want to convey. And you can be transparent or legitimate as you think you can be. But if you try to deviate from that, your audiences will know better how to verify your story, how to make sure your credibility is there or isn't. It's also became a means for feedback and accountability. Like, for example, I personally, as a Jordanian citizen, utilize the Twitter, for example, for interacting with different governmental sectors in Jordan or municipalities, like the municipality of Amman, for example, or the Secretariat. If there are any complaints that I have, if there are any notes that I have, I can tweet at them directly, and they're obliged to respond, and they do immediately most of the time. This would not have been possible if it wasn't for social media. The other side of social media is that there are now even companies that are dedicated just for handling your social media account 24/7, working on social media on your behalf, serving your audience, interacting with them, polishing your brand or advertising it as well as you would like it to be. And I have to say they are specialists in their work, and now it has become a world of its own, and it needs its own experience. It needs its own specialty. It's not something that anyone can do, as unfortunately some people still think. For NGOs in general, just like the NGO that I work at, Care International, social media is also very, very crucial and very integral. We have started working in social media in Care a couple of years ago before I joined, but particularly I tried to improve that through Facebook and Twitter last year. And we use social media for interacting with our audiences, and we publish whatever related topics there are. We show our work, we interact with the audiences, we receive private messages from Syrian refugees as well as from other audiences who are interested in our work or who are interested in asking whatever questions they have, or even sometimes it could be a good means for airing grievance if they have any problems, if they have any complaints about the work. And that's the best way to do it, by hearing it directly from your audiences. And we even have frequently asked questions that are answered because you definitely would receive that same questions from time to time. And that's something you should definitely work on. Why social media is very important for our audiences and for our work. For example, if I want to talk about the Syria crisis, in July 2014, the UNHCR has published a survey that they had conducted, and the result didn't actually get published widely publicly, but it was shared with us at least. And it was very interesting to know that the second most trustworthy and common means for communication and for delivering information among Syrian refugees in Jordan and in Lebanon was social media, and particularly Facebook. So when they conducted this survey, Syrian refugees themselves said that social media is highly important for them for delivering information, for receiving this kind of information. And also it got a very high ranking in terms of credibility, because all of them watch the TV, but very few of them believe it anymore. And for example, interestingly enough as well, everyone thinks that pamphlets or leaflets or brochures would do the job. No, they didn't actually. They fell down the bottom of the ranking. So that's why social media is very, very important and crucial for different types of audiences. And I have to say also, the good thing about social media is that you can also use it for something that is called communicating with communities, or you can also call it disaster risk reduction. So for example, when we had the huge snowstorms the last 2 months in the Middle East, we were able to warn the audiences, our audiences, especially Syrian refugees, for example, about that, and share with them some good practices of preparing for winter, especially that most of them live in rundown apartments, in underprepared housings, and that's heartbreaking enough. But being a very underfunded crisis, you have to improvise and you have to be smart and you have to try all your best to utilize whatever means you have to mitigate risks or to help your audiences and your beneficiaries improve their lives. The last thing that I wanna share with you guys is that this is the age of social media, and that accountability, two-way flow, and feedback are being very, very crucial, very important, and that's why social media. That's why this is the age or the era of social media, and you cannot afford to keep pace with this era without taking all that into consideration. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for your talk, Mahmoud. Now I would like to give all of you the opportunity to respond to his speech. Every one of you has about 5 minutes before we start with the general discussion. Let's start with you, Timo.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Mahmoud, for your speech. There were a lot of good points that I'd like to connect to. First, whenever I have the opportunity to present at a forum like this, I'd like to ask a question to the audience, which is, please raise your hands. How many know the social media policy of your own organization? And this is a social media talk. So this ratio, interesting enough, has become, was quite stable over the years. And I think, when I look at organizations and where are there, challenges in embracing social media, I see two different main problems. One is, how do we deal with staff using social media? So how do we deal with the fact that all of a sudden, communication is not the sole purview of the communications department anymore, but everybody can do it. And obviously, staff guidelines are the first step, and it's still interesting to see, that so little of that exists. But I don't want to dwell on that too much, because I think that's also a great topic for discussion in the second part of this, because I see a second big challenge which is connected to that, which is not only do we see social media as the responsibility of the communications department, we also see it mainly, or many organizations do, as mainly a marketing or fundraising instrument. But that means we're disconnected from the experience of many affected people who are using social media, because they're using it as an operational tool. They're using it as a tool through which they organize themselves to fill their own needs. We see it as a marketing thing. So there we have really a big disconnect from them. Obviously, those needs they try to fill, they can be material, immaterial. We've seen that in disasters, ranging from Indonesia over the Philippines to, Austria, actually, where people use social media to, organize food, blankets, fill sandbags, everything like that. So it's very operational in the experience of the affected people. And if we as humanitarian organizations are not listening to that, then we have a whole segment of the response, the self-recovery, of which we don't really know what's happening there. And that's a problem then for defining the response on our side. The other big problem is, and I think that is something where we really need to do more, is the need for information. People always say information is aid, and I think that's very true. But we need to do more to provide that kind of aid. You just mentioned that you're using it very much to communicate with affected people, and I think that's excellent. One example I like to use is actually from Nigeria, from the Ebola response, because this panel is called Social Media Heaven and Hell, and I have two examples for that. At the beginning of the Ebola response in Nigeria, there was a rumor that by drinking salt water and bathing in salt water, you could prevent, getting Ebola. That was spread through social media, and as a result, 2 people died and at least 20 were hospitalized. That would be the hell part. But very quickly, civil society in Nigeria started to push back. They created, for example, an account, Ebola Alert, which today has 69,000 followers and was reaching up to 200,000 people per day. And they managed to turn this around. What I find interesting in that is not only that there was obviously a need for information that wasn't filled, and because it wasn't filled, it was filled with bad information, but then the response to that was not that came from humanitarian organizations or the CDC or anybody like that, but it came from people within the country. In this case, it was actually dentists who started it. And there's obviously nothing wrong with a dentist starting something like that, but it's interesting that we fail consistently to address these information needs that are clearly there. And a lot of people say, like, well, you know, my country, where I work in a humanitarian organization, you know, they don't have smartphones and stuff like that. And I think in a lot of cases that is true, but the GSMA tells us that today, 2/3 of all smartphones connections are from developing countries. And by 2020, it will be 4/5. So we really need to start to rethink that. And so, you know, from my perspective, you know, what is needed? I think there are 3 things that are needed. One is, you know, as humanitarian organizations, we need to learn how to monitor and to respond to the conversations that are happening in social media networks. And that means you need to move the social media function to the country level. You need strong national staff who do that, because, you know, if you're in Myanmar and you're an international staff, you're not going to be able to read, you know, Facebook in Burmese. So we need to bring that to the national level and build capacity there. We need to use it as an instrument for transparency and accountability, because we hear time and again, there was a study actually that came out yesterday, who said, like, you know, the affected people think we are not accountable, so we need to use that. And the third is we really need to use it to connect with self-recovery efforts of the population. And yeah, that are my 2 big issues that I'd like to share.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Ingrid, would you like to
Sure.
have your talk?
So I'm going to talk about something quite different. The topic of our debate is social media, heaven or hell. And I think at the moment we see both. We can see that social media can be heaven and it can be hell. Timo and Mahmoud already talked about the role of NGOs and how NGOs can build up a form of dialogue. But I want to talk about the role of traditional media and the difficulties traditional media face in these crisis regions. At the moment, I see 2 big issues there. First of all, we have a situation where journalists are confronted with quite a massive amount of propaganda material and a massive amount of jihadists who are spreading this material, some more actively, of course, than others. There's a new study called the ISIS Twitter Census, and it says that there are at least 46,000 genuine Twitter accounts which are tweeting on behalf of the Islamic State, and this is the lower estimate they have. This estimate was published months after Twitter started banning and deleting accounts by the Islamic State. And this study shows this clearly does not work. What we see online is kind of a mouse and cat and mouse game, where there are ever new ways presented by terrorist groups to bring their propaganda to the surface. And here we see, first of all, that the power has shifted and traditional media has lost a lot of its power. But secondly, and I think this is the more problematic situation, is that there are parts of traditional media which are using this social media in a very uncanny fashion. To some extent, even traditional media are, in my opinion, using this Islamic propaganda for their own propaganda. And the best example that shows how far this can go is Fox News. Fox News showed the video where you can see a hostage held by the Islamic State who was burned alive. And I have their statement here. I'm going to read it to you so you can think about it yourself, what you think is right or wrong. Fox News explained their showing of this material on their website with the following statement. They said, "After careful consideration, we decided that giving readers of foxnews.com the option to see for themselves the barbarity of ISIS outweighed legitimate concerns about the graphic nature of this video. Online users can choose to view or not view this disturbing content. So they said people should see for themselves how horrible this stuff is. And I think this could not be any wronger, could not be worse in a way. This is not just irresponsible. I think we see at the moment the dramatic nature of social media for the first time, and also we see how traditional media in a way are failing or also are making their own, like say, agenda based on this material. And so that's what I would perhaps like to talk with you about later.
Thank you very much. Thomas, you're also working as a journalist. Maybe you can relate to what Ingrid said, or just...
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to... I'm trying to go maybe one step, look from a helicopter's kind of view. But first of all, thanks a lot for having me here. I'm extremely honored to sit on this panel, and also honored to be in this hall of my alma mater, Wiener, which is celebrating its 650th birthday, and an institution that's actually older than my newspaper that was founded in 1703. So I'm really glad to be here in this in my old university. Happy birthday. What I want to say is what Ingrid already touched upon is we live in a world without filters. Before, legacy media, old media had this role to say, well, this is maybe a little bit too disturbing to show to a wider public. And Ingrid just pointed out that some of the media institutions are not even doing that, not really even fulfilling that role that they had in the old times. And so social media gives the actors in a conflict or in any situation direct access to an audience. And that can be do-gooders, like CARE, for instance, NGOs, a lot of institutions that you represent here, I guess. And that can be powers that maybe not have the best intentions. And that is, of course, one of the root problems, that there is this direct access that can be used for good, as Timo pointed out, or bad. So social media between heaven and hell, I think it's both. We have already figured that out, I think, in this talk. And the other problem is also that, of course, these editorial decisions that we are taking as journalists, what material to show, what not to show, etc., we're also trying to provide a trustworthy and also neutral platform in a conflict. And now it's just basically you can hear all sides, which is, of course, I think definitely something that has enriched the whole media environment and has enriched also the kind of the sources that people can use. And at the same time, of course, also that Ingrid pointed out that the traditional media, legacy media, whatever you want to call it, have cut back budgets. So this role that I think is more and more important, the more the noise grows of social media actors, the more we would need this neutral platform, that kind of these rechecks and balances and so on that the old media is trying to provide and has provided. But of course, we are on the retreat. As Ingrid pointed out, it's not exactly that we have the best of times, at least from a financial point of view at this point. So that is that is one problem. The other problem is what I would call the speed kills. So, for instance, to establish facts, has something happened or not? Where has it happened? How many victims? What is really going on? Usually this needs time. And on the social media, on the internet, we don't have time because things are very fast. I know that there was a rush to kind of establish the so-called truth after the MH17 incident over Ukraine. You remember it. And it was clear, of course, which side has the most compelling story, which side has the most credible story. And it was clear that, at least for me and myself, that an airplane which flies from basically the northwest to the southeast is probably not being shot down by the Ukrainians, because usually you don't shoot the planes that come from the friendly side. But nevertheless, of course, it was quite interesting to see this conversation going on. It was clear that maybe it was not. The most important thing is that when something like that happens in a conflict, to be the first with the news out, because then you frame the debate. That's what's going on. And this kind of lightning-fast information flow is really a problem for us journalists, because we can't really handle it, because what you usually do, and it happened in the MH17 incident, you flood the zone, as we would say. So that means you send your journalists out, have them make phone calls, send someone to the scene, and then to provide pictures, to provide evidence, to go there and actually see what's going on. And do we have that time? And that is, I think, a problem. And can legacy media provide a civilized yet provocative antidote to the screaming talking heads that dominate political debate, as I think the claim of Left, Right, and Center, a wonderful NPR program, says. And that is really a question, I think, that should be raised. And let me even expand the whole thing even one more step. And what's interesting, and I've observed this also, and let me be a little bit more political here, that we have seen a lot of social media accelerated square revolutions. Remember, Tahrir Square, Maidan Square. So let's call them the square revolutions. That is the question, did they lead to anything more than la révolution dévorer ses enfants? That means the revolution devours its children. If I look at Tahrir Square in Egypt, that seems to be very much the case. So there seems to be a problem that social media, with its speed and with what's going on, is very effective in kind of pushing a revolution forward and then bring down a government. But so far, I can see no meaningful contribution to something like nation building, because I think there is this disconnect between the speed of social media and the speed of the traditional political process and the institutions. And this disconnect, I think, is something that we should bear in mind. We have a political context that probably all of you operate in. We have parliaments, we have governments, we have institutions. You have your own institutions that have different checks and balances and controls. And of course, in the internet, this all doesn't exist. Here, it's all about speed, speed, speed. Let's go fast, right? And I think that disconnect is something that we should all bear in mind. And that's what I think creates this disconnect between the traditional world, whatever it is, and kind of this new world that we're in.
Thank you very much. Talking about speed, maybe we can talk about that now. I assume there are many people present here today who work for NGOs and are perhaps struggling with their social media strategy. So it would be interesting to hear about the biggest challenges when working with social media in the humanitarian field. And maybe Mahmoud, would you like to share some of your experiences? It would be interesting to hear what are the biggest challenges when working with social media in the humanitarian field? Where do you see the greatest potential? And maybe you can also tell us some examples. What kind of post, what situation went really well, and where did you fail?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it is very good to start in the center and then spread wide. So as you have mentioned multiple times now, having, and Timo also brought up a very, very important point, having social media policies and guidelines in general for your own staff in your NGO, because that's the difference between classic media or mainstream media or any type of media and social media, is that in social media, every person himself or herself can play a role in that. So, for example, one of the country offices, Care Jordan, that of course, for the physical nature, we work closely together. It has in total between staff and volunteers about maybe 200 or more, and they're increasing every day. And if you want to look at how each and every one of these staff uses social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., many of them tweet stuff or post stuff from their daily work in the field, because they are field people, they are field workers, they work firsthand with the beneficiaries, whether that was refugees or other people. So it was very, very important at one point to come up with this policy and guidelines and make sure that each and every one of these staff members receive them and adhere to them. And I have to say, they have been very cooperative, but the problem sometimes is by keeping consistency of this and making sure that it's not just a trend that lasts for a couple of weeks and then they forget about it. And then, I mean, we're all human beings. I can sometimes see something that would agitate me or make me want to strongly say something. But of course, I have to put first, especially as a communications person, the good or whether like the position of my NGO that I represent. In social media, it is very important. One of the big policies and guidelines that we tell all the staff about is that you do work from 8 to 4 or from 9 to 5, but in your social media and in your public life in general, even if you have your own private personal life that no one can interfere with or tell you what or what not to do, but you have to know that you're representing your NGO 24/7. It's not that once you quit your field work or went home or walked out of your NGO door, that means that that's it. Your professional life has gone into a blackout for now. No, it's consistent. It continues. One of the big problems that's I mean a big challenge. Another challenge would be, for example, if we and Timo can relate, for example, as NGO communications people, because we need this visibility and we need this interaction and we need this transparency to our beneficiaries. We have to always create hooks, create events related to these hooks, etc. So now, because we're in the age of social media, as I was saying, a lot of these things have to relate to social media. And so sometimes it's very difficult to guess what people can relate to and what they cannot relate to, and what will actually attract them via social media and generate their interest, or even make them really relate to it directly, and what will not. So you try your best. You try to, all what you have to do, I would say, regarding that is not trying too hard, but just try to reflect the reality that you face with people on a daily basis via social media, because it is a society medium after all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, and how do you work with the problem of speed that was mentioned? You have to react very quickly. There are many situations where you have to post something on Twitter in like 5 or 10 minutes. How do you work with that? And maybe then, Timo, what would you advise NGOs how to organize breaking news in NGOs?
I mean, when we studied media, one of the most important descriptions or means of having a successful hit or news piece is being accurate as much as possible, and at the same time being as fast as possible. Now with social media, speed has multiplied by dozens of times or hundreds of times. So sometimes accuracy is the problem, as you were saying. I think the only way to do that is by 2 ways. First of all, if you don't have time, then make sure not to take your news except from 100% verified news outlets or sources of news. And there are media monitoring companies now that can help with that. But if you do have time, then make sure to reflect on that, to improve that, to sort of not extend, but probably verify more and more media outlets that you can take the sources of news from. And it doesn't actually have to be media outlets. It can be the people themselves on the ground. That's why we do have, I can't do the whole work of the region, so I have media focal points who are well-trained and well-informed and can do a part of the job as accurately and as correctly and professionally as possible.
So humanitarian organizations and NGOs, they have to work as kind of media organizations nowadays. How do you think that works nowadays, or how it should be, how social media work in the humanitarian field could be organized?
Well, I think they don't really have to work as media organizations, but they have to be aware that they're operating in a media environment. I think what you see, when you look at speed, I think, at the kind of headquarters level, I think it makes sense if you have, there's an earthquake or something like that, but you don't know what happened yet. Simply pushing out, we know there has been an earthquake, we're looking into it. That in itself, even though it doesn't contain a lot of info, is already, saying like, okay, we're onto it. And then, it comes back to, having good people locally. I'm actually thinking back a little bit to a couple of years ago, 2 years ago, when the Boston Marathon bombing happened. I thought it was very interesting to see that the account of the Boston Police Department, they actually did not write original tweets themselves. what they did is they knew which of their staff was using social media, and pretty much all they did is they looked at, like, okay, who's saying what. Instead of trying to say something themselves, they just shared what their staff was seeing and doing. Now, obviously, that is something that works better, like in a high-income country where that is more common. But you can also break that down to volunteers. There's a couple of ideas of, like, if I'm the communications person sitting somewhere, I do not have the capacity to go through all these messages and do all of that. So there are mechanisms where you can either use your own volunteers, or what you can do is you can actually, you can basically crowdsource the analysis. There are free services that humanitarian organizations can use where they say, like, please break down the tweets for me.
Could you name some of them?
Yeah, I mean, there's the best one to go through is the Digital Humanitarian Network, because that is an umbrella for a number of specialized organizations, and they then they set up a system for you, and they do that within a day. This also goes for mapping. This goes for all the things that can be digitalized. Because at the end of the day, for me, this is not about Facebook and Twitter. This is about that the way we exchange information has changed fundamentally from a centralized approach to something like, oh, it's digital, so I can give it to anyone, and anyone can do anything with it. So we're breaking down work in more and more pieces, and I think that's what's really powerful. And actually, one of the best examples I saw recently was from MSF, who in the Ebola response, they asked online volunteers to help them map locations. So they send them satellite images where they didn't know what the places were, and they say, like, okay, I see a village here, I see a village here, I see a village here. And then on the ground, they used those maps to find out what the names of those villages were, and all of a sudden they had a map. So I think this goes a little bit away from, what is the media, concept. But I think we just need to rethink, our approach of, like, oh, I am somebody who's pushing out information to more something like I'm somebody who's curating information and benefiting from the information that comes from outside.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. You told us that social media is very powerful to getting out to people. I'd like to ask you, Ingrid, you wrote a piece about Facebook's algorithm, which is making it difficult for serious content to reach users. This is a very interesting point. The background, for those of you who don't know about the algorithm, content which is shared and liked often is more likely to reach a lot of users than content where people don't interact a lot. So what does that mean for organizations in the humanitarian field who obviously have to deal with content which is not really likable most of the time, which is serious content for people who need help?
That's a really interesting question. To illustrate this problem, probably many of you have heard about Ferguson and the demonstrations in this town after a young black man was shot by the police and he died. And after that, there were huge demonstrations against police brutality in the United States. And many Americans experienced the same interesting phenomenon. Their whole Twitter account was full of Ferguson, full of this topic of police brutality, police racism. And Facebook was full of, let's say, wedding pictures and cats. And so there was suddenly this debate, why isn't Facebook catching on? And this is apparently because the algorithm of Facebook is showing you rather content which is likable, which is positive, which is probably close to your private life. And this leads to a black hole, at least in the first few hours of this event. And this is a huge issue for media organizations, but I also think for NGOs. If you're not the #1 trending topic, there is a high chance that your issue might become invisible. And at the moment, we clearly do not have enough settings to change that, because I, as a user, for example, as a Facebook user, cannot choose to have a different view on all of my information. I cannot switch this algorithm off and say I want to see everything. And actually, even Twitter is changing, and Twitter wants to implement more and more algorithms to show you content which you perhaps did not even choose yourself, or perhaps not show you sometime in the future. This is just hearsay. Perhaps show you not everything you wanted to see at the beginning. So I think we are seeing new problems with algorithms here, especially if these algorithms are so designed to show you the nicer aspects of life.
So maybe there, journalists and media could help spreading the serious content. And maybe, Mahmoud, how do you, when it comes to fundraising or getting out serious content to people, do you think about how to get many likes? Is that a problem for you or a challenge, or don't you think about that at all?
Interesting question. I mean, just like I was saying in my speech, you really shouldn't think about that very profoundly, and put so much effort into thinking about the virality of your posts via likes or comments or whatever, because I mean, and the colleagues know better, there are so many posts that people are interested in and they click on, they read, they see, but they don't interact. And you have so many, especially in sponsored stories or paid ads, etc. You have so many posts where people just check it, they click like, and they move on, and they don't even know what they liked, what they clicked like on. It's like there's a tragic example, but for example, if someone posts on Facebook, my father died this morning, you would see a lot of people who like this post, and there's nothing to like about it, but it's just the nature of social media. So I don't think they are very relevant.
I see.
Just one thing to add up just quickly, because I think that it's a tough situation for NGOs, because you're competing for audience, and you're also competing for money for donations. And just to show you that I think it is a game where you try to get the most audience, the most likes, the most retweets. There was this, you probably read about this, it was everywhere in the news. On Twitter, when the Islamic State started its propaganda, there was the hashtag of Cats of Jihad. And it's the most absurd thing you could imagine. So IS fighters were posting pictures of cats next to guns and collecting likes for that. And this is just showing you how absurd this game, where you try to get the most likes or the most favorites, the most retweets, has become.
Yeah, thank you. This is maybe also a reason why NGOs often see social media as a B2B communication, so maybe talking to journalists. So Thomas, how do you see social media in the humanitarian field? Do you, as a journalist, engage with organizations in social media, or do you use it for research?
Yeah, of course, the social media is a very useful tool. So it's not only I talked about the directness of possible contact, it's not only the NGOs sometimes. I mean, if you look on Facebook, there is a Facebook group, I think it's called Voices of Zaatari, which is the biggest refugee camp in Jordan, with more than 50,000, 80,000, thanks, 80,000 people who fled the war in Syria. And they give you stories of their lives and what's going on there and so on, and humanize the thing. And maybe that's one step in that direction. What Ingrid said also, maybe to find on not only, okay, this is a tragedy of war, and I think that, of course, the journalists and also the NGOs should point out that that's the case. But at the same time, there's always stories of hope. There's always stories of, okay, we're getting somewhere. We're trying to get out of this tragedy. And therefore, you have some of this kind of more, let's say, positive messages of people who definitely live in misery. I mean, nobody wants to live in the Zaatari refugee camp. But at the same time, they're trying to convey a message, okay, we're doing all we can do to kind of get back a normal life, even in this refugee camp. And I think that is maybe something that you have been talking about, to how to get out of positive stories that people can relate to. And at the same time, of course, there's one other thing, that's journalists can find very valuable sources. I mean, let's not forget that, of course, if you cannot go, I personally would not advise any journalist to go to Mosul at the moment. And so the only thing you can do, you can, of course, like the BBC does for their radio shows, phone with people who actually live there. You can then engage with people because, believe it or not, I mean, even in the IS, the internet works, the phone works. So, by the way, that's the strange thing the Iraqi government provides for this infrastructure. So it's quite interesting. But these things work, and you can do that. And also, maybe let me just give you another example from the Syrian context. There is a blogger called Brown Moses who basically did all this by using his social media context, his internet context with kind of crowdsourcing, looking at public domain pictures and trying to build cases for war crimes, for instance. And that's not a journalist who was being paid by a media organization. That was just, at least at the beginning, a normal citizen sitting in Britain who had educated himself about weapons and things like that. And he starts doing something that the ICRC is known for establishing war crimes. And that is quite an interesting thing. So I would say, of course, it gives you a lot of instruments at hand to do good. But also, should I reply to some of the things that are posted on the social media wall?
Yeah, definitely. Go ahead.
Because obviously I have got myself into a little bit of trouble by saying this quote of "speed kills," and some people in the audience disagree with me. And of course, Tobias is right when he says, yes, of course we can adjust our own schedule, and we don't have to be driven by the speed that, the rhythm that comes from social media. At the same time, I think it's very hard, because again, going back to the Boston bomber case and then the manhunt that was going on, some journalists got themselves into real trouble there because they were not speedy enough, and then they reported, excuse my language here, bullshit. So that's what happened, and I agree with Tobias, who says, well, yes, of course, then, restrain yourself and don't get carried away and act according to your own schedule. So that's true. And another intervention was, I think it was from Gerald, from the audience here also, and he said, well, isn't there also a problem, because I used the word truth, which is always, I think, a dangerous thing to do. I did it nevertheless, because I think that's what journalists at least should strive to go as close to the truth as they can go. And he said, well, in the times like these, it's even more and more difficult to establish something like the truth, because there is a lot of things going on. And I think probably what both of us here would agree on, that there is a lot of propaganda, and there's a lot of counter-propaganda, there is information, there's disinformation, and every war nowadays has their own info department. I mean, IS has a huge propaganda division. In the Russian-Ukrainian context, we see that there is even, media institutions, state media institutions, waging this information and disinformation war. And all of us know that the best way to hide the truth is embedded between two lies. So, yes, I agree. A lot of people these days would not believe a lot of things going on in the world because they think, well, maybe it's stage managed, maybe it's manipulated, and so on. This is clearly a problem.
Definitely, yeah. This brings us to the question of verification. Now for media organizations and for NGOs, we have to find out what of this propaganda, what of this content we find online is real or is not propaganda. So, Timo, maybe can you tell us there are verification tools, there are handbooks, maybe you can help give some advice for the audience, which tools are helpful and how you can work with that.
Yeah, sure, thank you. I actually also posted in my Twitter account the link to the Digital Humanitarian Network that I mentioned earlier, and you will find some of those resources there. I think it starts with, there's something called I think it's actually called the Social Media Verification Handbook, and that was originally written for and by journalists. And it's a very good resource because it just gives you, some fundamentals, that says like, okay, what can I find out, if I look at an account, and it's not so much about determining is it true or is it not, because if you're not there, you can't do that. But you can determine, is it more credible or less credible? So instead of trying to say, like, I want to have truth, you have 5 or 6 different sources, and you start to weigh their credibility. And things come in there like, how old is the account? So if this is an account that has posted from the same location for like the last 3 years, consistently and has a big following, then it's more credible that what he says from that location, could be accurate. As opposed to somebody who just created an account like 5 minutes ago and now says he's an expert from that. It could still be the case. It could still be the case, but you're weighing credibility. But that also comes back to there's a very interesting, actually this week was presented a project which is called Verily. So it's very like as a VERI .ly, and that is a project that was started, I think, originally as a PhD thesis in the UK, where news organizations and humanitarian organizations, they can upload materials, and then everybody is just being asked, simple question. For example, is this photo taken in Damascus? And then people can just say like yes or no, and they can respond to why they think that, which is it's like very primitive in a way. But a lot of things you can say, and I know BBC is doing that with information. When they see it, they look at it a lot, and they say like. It's fascinating. For example, they look at road signs. So like, do these road signs exist in the country? Is this even? Or if they have a video, they listen to the accent. They ask people, does this accent exist in that country? Now, the BBC can do that because they have so many people working for them. When we try to, or when the media tries to verify information, we can't. But we can outsource that. And if we then have like 5 people who say like, what? Actually, this building is in Malta and not in Damascus. Then you can say like, okay, so now I found that out.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Other
may I
tools?
just
use
it because there's just more came in through the social.
Yeah, and you are now able to ask questions from the audience via Twitter wall and the old-fashioned way as well, just speaking up. It's possible.
Let me just respond to the ones that already came in while we were speaking. Of course, Tobias made a very good point in saying, well, what about who determines actually the speed that we're operating under? And then he said, the marketing department maybe wants you to create clicks. I'm in the happy position that my marketing department is not really putting pressure on me, but I'm pretty sure that with a lot of other media institutions, that's the case, that they want clicks no matter what. So Tobias is absolutely right here, and I couldn't agree more. Fortunately for myself, that's not the case, but I think he's right that that's a problem, that the media has its own agenda too. And just to let me add something also, what Timo said, the problem is with, I think it was Ivan Krastev, who actually has a great TED talk all about that the trend now is in mistrust we trust. So basically, credibility is the most important thing, and let's just assume that one of the most credible NGOs out there, the Red Cross, that they have some scandal, like Greenpeace had a financial scandal, and that really tarnished their image for a lot of donors. And of course, with huge institutions, something can go wrong. And then I think damage control for the people that we all believe in, that they are the do-gooders, but there are problems too. So I think that is a huge problem also. The moment something small happens, that of course in any company, in any institution can happen, that goes wrong and that tarnishes your whole image, and that is being used against you. So I think that is the big problem also, that keeping things in perspective. And how do we deal with that? We have more and more an audience that is really mistrustful, whatever we say. I mean, the media, NGOs, governments, institutions, no matter what.
If I may add an example, just anonymously speaking, for example, regarding how big and how problematic social media can be. One of the aid workers that is who was based in Syria last summer tweeted one small tweet that indicated the location of one of the armed groups in Syria, and that went viral, and all the news wrote about it just because of one tweet. And unfortunately, the name of the organization had CARE in it, so we as CARE had to do risk management for something that we absolutely had nothing to do with, and it went on for a couple of months. And we, of course, me being one of the few Arabic-speaking communications people in CARE, I had to monitor anonymous accounts using certain hashtags or searching on certain things on Twitter and check out the Twitter accounts of colleagues and see who's being followed by whom, or what tweets are they receiving, and translate some of that and share with my colleagues so that we can mitigate any kind of risks, or at least be able to expect what might come out of this. So just like Thomas was saying, it can just go wrong because of really simple things like one tweet that can affect you for several months.
Mm-hmm. Oh, well, thank you. Maybe let's talk a bit about encryption. Does it make communication really safer? Maybe where are the questions? Maybe before that, from the audience. It's more important. Yeah, over there. Go ahead. Okay.
So, hello, my name is Raluca Fervain-Slămnescu. I'm from SOS Children's Villages International. And it's a question maybe and a comment, and you don't have to address it immediately, but maybe later on. If I look to your clients, Tino, and to your organization CARE, we talk about huge international organizations, and they see no borders and limits in 3 different aspects. Yes, we have thousands of coworkers, and everybody has access to Facebook and tweet. So everybody can tweet and put on Facebook messages from that affects the work of our organization. We have headquarters and heads in different locations, and we follow on different activities happening in national context and international. And if it's a decision to be taken in Vienna, New York sleeps, so I cannot wake up my colleague and see and solve the speed issue. And it's also an issue of how our organization communicates. We communicate for fundraising purposes, for branding, public relationships, but we communicate for advocacy. And it's very important how am I communicating from an international office perspective and how my message gets aligned by colleagues at national offices. And it's also a question how our beneficiaries, people we work with and we work for, communicate about us and how I communicate about my work with them. And I was very much interested to see your opinions about how these absolutely massive organizations deal with the issue of communication and with the exposure that social media open to them now.
Thank you. If I may respond to that, CARE works in about 90 countries around the world, and of course that's a huge number. And you can, like, if you want to count how many workers that are in CARE, there are in fact thousands. The 2 main ways that I think would definitely relate to this and be very helpful. First of all, again going back to social media guidelines and policies. So for me personally, because I'm responsible for the region, I helped creating policies and guidelines for each of these countries and coordinated that with the country directors so that they can approve of that, and if they have any suggestions that are related to the particular context of their country of response. So, and then to distribute that on all the employees in the region. That's from one side. From the other side, if it's on the international context, we have many communications colleagues in all of the CARE world, and many of them would be interested, of course, in the context of Syria and their Syria response per se. They would need to come through the regional communications team in order for them to communicate something that is relevant or related to the Syria response. And it's vice versa also. For example, if I want to, let's say, if I receive a request from an Austrian journalist to accommodate a visit or to do an interview, etc., any kind of media work, I have to connect that with the communications colleagues in CARE Austria, because that's the relevant country or like the relevant member office. And so they can also follow up on that and keep the journalist or this person who sent this request in their database and in ours, etc. So there's always this 2-way flow of communication, and we cannot work without that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think to start with, I'd like to say, like, isn't it great that you have thousands of staff who want to talk about the work that they are doing, right? I mean, I think that's kind of the idea. You know, most people who work in this sector, they're really passionate about what they do, you know, and they like to talk about it, and that's great, and that's a great resource. And I think that's the general attitude we need to have. You know, I totally agree, social media staff guidelines are essential, but they should be written from a, and they should be written from an enabling point of view. For example, what we used to say, you know, when I was still working for the Red Cross, we said, like, we absolutely want you to talk about the work, but only talk about the things you can actually see. You know, don't repeat things that you've heard. You know, just, you know, if you're working somewhere and you say, like, well, you know what, today's been a tough day because we received 5,000 new refugees and we had only beds for 2,500. Then, you know, that's not a good news story. That's something that marketing sometimes doesn't like. But you know what? It's genuine, it's honest, it's good. And the other thing we said is like, yeah, but, you know, just to check yourself, we came up with saying, like, you know, think about your mom, your boss, and CNN. Basically saying, you know, if what you're about to post, if you don't want your mom to see it, if you think you might run into problems with your dad, and if you would be really uncomfortable if that was shown on CNN, then maybe you should think twice about hosting it. So just as a kind of sanity check, and you can't do more. I think, you know, you can write 50-page documents about like how to use the emblem or logo and whatever, and that's all very nice. But at the end of the day, you have to be able to reduce it to something like very, very common sense. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the day, you know, it's a good thing that they're doing that. I think, for me, one of the most positive examples of showing how difficult humanitarian work can be was a UNHCR staff member in South Sudan, and she was in a refugee camp in the north there, and she just took photos of everyday life in the refugee camp. And, you know, people thought she was this crazy woman who was always walking around, but she was there also as a protection person. So, you know, she wasn't somebody coming in from outside who suddenly takes photos, but she was working with people every day, and they thought it was cool. And she took photos. For example, there was a plane that actually crashed, a supply plane and stuff like that, you know, which is definitely not a good news story, but, you know, nobody was hurt. And I remember her posting that image on Instagram and saying, like, you know, after the plane came down, we were just also grateful that nobody got hurt. And, you know, and just stuff like that. And within no time, she, as an individual, got 25,000 followers on Instagram because she was able to convey the reality from the field. And I think, you know, supporting that in a constructive way, I think that's the way to go.
I think just to comment on what you said, Timo, it's exactly what we call embracing setbacks. So, for example, like the example you mentioned, we were only prepared to receive 2,500 refugees, but we received 5,000. It's great to also then like follow up or elaborate on that later and say where we actually made it and we were able to serve all these 5,000 refugees. So this is why it is important to mention reality, even if it's not a great news story and it's a setback, but because it could definitely turn into a success story.
Ingrid, you wanted to add something
just
to that?
a small, short thought, quick thought. I cannot answer this question regarding large NGOs, but I think that I like to compare the current situation with the first era of the automobile, the car. When we developed cars for the first time, they didn't have you didn't have seat belts, you didn't have those things on the window which wash away the water, I don't know what it's called in English. Windshield. You didn't have all these safety tools in the car, you just could drive from A to B. And I think this is also the state in which we are currently in regarding the internet. And so when there's a lot of confusion how to deal with all this information, how to deal with tweets that are wrong. And I think when I look at many of these conflicts, you can see often within days that there are suddenly new standards evolving. You see that demonstrations are getting more and more organized online, that they use suddenly new hashtags, that they use a new system of showing where there are police forces active, where there are other forces active. So I think we are living in an age where there is more and more standardization regarding this online communication. And I think this can be part of the solution when we talk about speed. It will not be the whole solution, but part of the solution when it comes to speed is that there are normal standards on which you can rely on. And secondly, about the whole speed issue, I think it's really a learning curve because many journalists, many of you probably have had this experience that you retweet something and it's wrong, and probably the second time you're thinking long about it. And I think this is a process we're just going through right now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Some more questions? Yeah, over there.
Thank you. My name is Franz Schmidiel, VIDC, Vienna Institute. I thank you, the panelists, very much for the insight in social media and use in NGOs and also the challenges. But I would be also interested about the social media strategy of conflict parties. Like it was mentioned at the beginning, the jihadist groups. For example, do you think that they put these disturbing videos in the social media because there's also a competition among the jihadist groups for public attention, for visibility? Is there this competition like among NGOs, or there are other motivation? So could you elaborate a little bit the social media strategy from the outside of jihadist groups?
I couldn't hear you.
I think I can try to respond to that. I was covering the war in Chechnya in the good old times, in the end of the 90s, actually the second Chechen war. And already that what you've been talking about, issue you've been raising, was already there, at least in part. Because what was going on there was a few people with video cameras, and they were documenting the war from the Chechen rebel side. And I haven't seen these people because I was with basically embedded, you could say, with the Chechen nationalists. But the Basayev people, who were the jihadi fighters, they did this video documentary to send them back to their donors. You know what I mean? It's amazing. They were basically filming an attack on a Russian convoy and then sending this tape back to their donors in the Arab Peninsula to show them, okay, this is what we have achieved. So $10,000 you sent us, or maybe $100,000, or maybe even more, was in good hands. And I think what the issue that you're raising is also clear today that, of course, there's recruiting and there's financing, because at least that's what I know from the war in Iraq in, let's say, 2005 or something. Most fighters, they are fighting for the jihadi cause, or for the terrorists, as the Americans call them, were doing that for money. There was even a price list. RED on the ground costs this much, an attack costs this much, to pay a sniper for that long costs this much. So I think that's exactly what you say, that it's not only it's recruitment, it's of course propaganda, it's to show the cause, and at the same time it's also to raise money. At least that's my experience in this context.
If I may add, I mean, it's a social media medium after all, so anyone can have access to it and can post, unfortunately, and sometimes fortunately, but I have to say unfortunately, whatever they want. So there is no guideline, there is no censorship from this social medium itself. So there's only so much you can do. So until a certain extent, what we can able to mitigate risks through, or utilize our experience to sort of, I wouldn't say control, but at least improve, we can do that. But then comes risk management, and then comes the way you have to respond to these kinds of issues if they are relevant to me.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to add an example to that. What was really interesting in the 2011 Egyptian protests, the internet was turned down completely. There was an internet shutdown. And shortly after that, engineers from Google, they started to have a Twitter operating without internet. So you could phone in and say something, and people could read it on Twitter, which was really interesting. You just had to use the Twitter hashtag Egypt. And so Twitter itself became highly political. What do you think about that, like Google and Twitter helping the protesters?
I mean, they have this power, but the good way to think about it, I would say, is to think of Twitter itself as a medium or as a tool, not as the politic per se, or as the person who is controlling the process. It's evident, and definitely social media helped spread voices wider, etc. But even before, this sort of political usage of things has always existed. But the way it improved with social media is that now you can hear from the different parties and from the two ways. So, well, if you don't like it, if you don't like what I'm saying on social media being side A of the conflict, then you, as being side B of the conflict, can also use the same arms or the same tools that I'm using to respond to that and to add your perspective. And then the audience is free to believe either this or that based on what they can relate to and based on what sounds more credible.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Okay, so maybe let's talk about the dangers also for people on the ground, for normal people using social media. Of course, there's a lot of potential, but for people, especially who are against the government, social media can become very dangerous. Are there some examples, or for example, I was told that also concerning the point encryption, people who used encryption, so encoded communication in Syria, were executed first just because they used encryption. No matter what they communicated, they didn't know it, but they raised suspicion just by using encrypted communication. What do you think about that? Maybe. Do you want to start, Timo?
Okay, I can start. I think there are two ways to look at it. I think if you look at it from an organizational perspective, then it depends on what you're actually doing with it. I think when I worked for ICSC, we always said, like when we do radio communications, it's always clear. You don't say, I'm going from location purple to location orange, but you're saying, I'm going from the university to Ottakring, so that, that it's clear what you're doing. Of course, if you have sensitive information, if you work in protection, or if you have medical information, it's a different matter. And I think you have to say, no, this information needs to be protected, and that's that. However, I think there is a lot of education needs to be done about, what can other people do with the information that you have. There's actually a Berlin-based NGO, Tactical Tech, and I'll also post that link. They provide whole toolkits around encryption. How do you anonymize because it's not just encrypting, it's also just stripping off information. There's a couple of years ago, I think it was a great example. There was somebody who was he was a criminal on the run, and he gave an interview to a newspaper. And the newspaper journalist actually took the photo and said, well, the FBI doesn't know where we are, but I've managed to interview. It was actually John McAfee, and he posted that link, but he posted it with the embedded GPS information where they were, and he was arrested the next day. Now, this is something where you're like, well. But of course, if you're talking, for example, to whatever vulnerable people, in a certain location, you just need to be sure that you know what information does your mobile phone, for example, communicate. And there are these things, like, as I said, Tactical Tech. They have this whole range of toolkits. There's something called, I think, Me and My Shadow, I think is what it is, which talks all about your digital traces. And, everybody sitting here, you can just go there and read through the instructions and find out how to do that. And I think we all need to become smarter. That's the thing.
Like you mentioned with the cars. We're
exactly.
just using cars. But I have another question maybe for the two journalists of you.
May I add something about the
of course.
encryption topic? I think what the example of Syria shows is that how extremely unsafe our digital communication is. Basically, we all communicate online in plain text. It's like when you send a postcard and everybody who is getting in touch with that postcards can read the content. So what encryption does is it hides, at least for all the people, all the networks that get in contact with your content, what you wrote about. So encryption for everybody makes sense. And the problem is many people are not aware. And often, of course, the people who are aware need to be aware. So at the moment when hardly anybody uses encryption, it means you endanger those people who really do need encryption. I made an interview with the filmmaker Laura Poitras, who made the movie about Edward Snowden, and she said, for example, encryption in her point of view is something like solidarity. Even if you do not need it, it helps you mask the other people. And if other people also, if so many people use encryption, then it's not possible to kill everybody. I mean, it's really horrible to kill everybody who uses encryption, because then it would be too many. So this is the basic problem right now. And then, why I think this is so important is, so clearly we do have regimes, we have horrible situations in which you are not just in an undemocratic state, you are also perhaps threatened by other people, and there you need encryption. And you see that regimes are against this. But the even worse situation is that even democratic countries are against encryption. And this is the tipping point. Because when you have the British Prime Minister who is saying that all encryption should be made, it can be read by police forces, then it's starting. So we have a situation where democratic governments want to take away these last freedoms of private communications. And this is a really tough situation, because you cannot break encryption a little bit, you have to break it altogether. And so we have a situation where democratic countries are actually developing those means and tools that can be then used in other countries as well. And how can we bring safety to those dissidents in countries in Syria or in Asia if we ourselves are building holes into this technology?
Yeah. Thank you. Is there one last question from the audience? Take your chance. So maybe we should talk a little bit about mistrust. Maybe Thomas, you can answer this question. Mistrust in traditional media. Through empowering people and also activists to post their content equally in social media like traditional media, there is more and more mistrust coming to traditional media, like, you know, the Lügenpresse, etc. So what do you think about that, and how can we react to that?
Yeah, I think first of all, this cult of mistrust is on the one hand a good thing, because of course democracy can only work if we mistrust our governments, otherwise we wouldn't have all these checks and balances in place. But I think there is then some sort of a line where things get out of hand. And maybe even if I look at the political system of the United States and the relationship between Congress and the president at this point, even there I would say this is maybe a little bit too much mistrust from both sides. So even the political system then does not, functions on a suboptimal level, let's put it this way. But we all agree that we need mistrust, because as journalists, if we hear a horrible story, then the first thought should be, okay, is that true? Can that be true? And so we all live from mistrust and being mistrustful. At the same time, the audience begins to mistrust us. And on the other hand, I think there is interesting developments going on. I go back to this Brown Moses that I talked about before. You can all Google him. I think most of you know him already. And there was the famous incident. You remember the case of the gas, using of gas in the suburbs, or basically in the parts of Damascus. And then there was Seymour Hersh, who is also a very renowned journalist who used to work with The New Yorker, who now published a story in the London Review of Books, basically saying, okay, this was more or less an act of the Turkish secret services, or whoever. He blamed the fair and square the Turks for that. And then there was a lot of online debate, and people were bringing in their case. Okay, what Seymour Hersh what is his argument? What is he's presenting, and then what is our argument? So I think what we should also learn as journalists, maybe the whole public, that we are more and more in a kind of a discursive environment. Before it was, okay, we are basically like here, standing up there and lecturing our audience, like in the in 650 years ago, maybe in the University of Vienna. And now it's very much led to use this picture, the students who would say, well, can that be true? And everybody has some means to corroborate the facts, to challenge you and challenge your opinions, challenge your line of thought. And that is a good thing, but at the same time, I think what we also need is some sort of neutral actors who kind of put this together and then trying to the best of their knowledge to say, okay, this is what's going on, this is what the debate is here, and then after studying carefully all these established facts and all these rumors and all that's kind of from credible to incredible, we believe, okay, this is what we think is the most credible outcome of this debate. And I think that's what's lacking, that the debate is going on, but we don't have any kind of lighthouses where we can look at and say, well, where do we stand? And I think that is the new normal that we have to face as journalists, and maybe also the public has to deal with that situation.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for discussing these crucial points with us. I think we've seen that social media are an aspect that have big impact on how humanitarian work is being done today, and it will be interesting to see what challenges new technologies will bring. Now all of us deserve a treat. Grab yourself a tasty lunch, just follow the signs next to us. And the modules 4 and 5 will continue here at 1:30, so be sure not to miss it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa.